You ever get those moments where you're reading something and a word just looks wrong? Like, you know what it's supposed to be, but it just seems off.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
I was reading this Gulf of America thing, and I swear my brain just, like, kept wanting to autocorrect it back to Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
You know? It's like someone moved your favorite coffee mug to a different cabinet.
I can see that.
Yeah.
Yeah, the familiar suddenly becomes unfamiliar. But in this case, it's not just like getting used to a new spot for your mug.
Right.
We're talking about like potentially changing the name of a massive geographical feature.
Yeah.
One that's deeply ingrained in our maps and our history and even our culture.
It's not just some random renaming either. We're talking about the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
The body of water that shaped so much of the coastal U.S. But now, thanks to a Trump-era executive order, it's officially the Gulf of America at the federal level.
Right.
And Florida lawmakers are pushing to make that change official in the state, too.
Wow.
Which means textbooks, legal documents, the whole shebang.
It's fascinating, though, isn't it? This ripple effect that a name change can have.
Yeah.
On the surface, it might just seem like a symbolic gesture, a way to kind of emphasize the Gulf's importance to the U.S.
Right.
But if you dig a little deeper, you start to uncover all these like layers of complexity.
Okay, so let's unpack this. What exactly are these Florida bills proposing?
Essentially, they want to like scrub Gulf of Mexico from all official state records and replace it with Gulf of America. We're talking about everything from laws and educational materials to highway signs.
Oh, wow.
It's a pretty extensive undertaking.
It sounds like a logistical nightmare.
Yeah.
Not to mention potentially expensive.
Yeah.
Especially for a state that's facing some pretty serious environmental challenges.
Yeah.
You know, like rising sea levels and hurricane intensification.
Exactly. And that kind of raises the question, like, what are the priorities here?
Yeah.
Is this really the most pressing issue facing Florida right now?
Right.
Or could those resources be better used elsewhere?
What about the impact on education? Florida already made headlines a few years ago for removing references to climate change from science textbooks.
Right.
This Gulf of America push feels like it could be part of a larger pattern of trying to control the narrative.
It's certainly something to consider. I mean, by renaming a body of water that's so inextricably linked to climate change impacts, are we subtly shifting the focus away from those very real and urgent issues?
And what about the economic implications? The Gulf of Mexico is a huge economic engine for Florida, especially for tourism and the fishing industry. Could changing the name have unintended consequences for those sectors?
It's definitely a possibility. I mean, think about all the branding and marketing that's built around the name Gulf of Mexico.
Right.
A sudden change could create confusion and disrupt established businesses. Not to mention the potential impact on international markets where Gulf of Mexico is the globally recognized name.
This reminds me of something I read about other countries changing geographical names for political or ideological reasons and the long-term controversies that often come from those decisions.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme throughout history, and it really highlights the power of language to shape our perception of the world. When we change a name, are we simply updating a label, or are we subtly altering our understanding of the place itself?
That's a great point. It's not just about semantics. It's about how we frame our relationship with the environment and with each other.
And speaking of relationships,
Yeah.
it's worth noting that the Gulf of Mexico isn't solely an American entity.
Right.
It borders Mexico and Cuba, and its ecosystem extends far beyond national boundaries.
So by calling it Gulf of America, are we potentially downplaying its significance to the wider region
Potentially.
and the need for international cooperation to address shared challenges?
That's a valid concern. It raises questions about how we perceive national identity and whether a name change could inadvertently promote a more inward-looking perspective, even if that's not the intention.
And before we go any further, let's remind everyone to follow meteorologist Rob Jones for more great insights on weather and climate. You can find him on Instagram at meteorologist, on TikTok as TV Meteorologist, and on YouTube, where you can also check out the Meteorology Matters podcast playlist. His channel name is Rob Jones Hurricane.
Awesome.
Now getting back to the Gulf.
This raises another interesting question. We know that Trump's executive order has already changed the name at the federal level.
Right.
But why is Florida going a step further and pushing to update everything at the state level,
Right.
even at a potential cost to taxpayers?
Yeah, what's the motivation there?
Is it purely symbolic?
Yeah.
Or is there something more strategic at play?
That's what we'll explore in more detail as we continue our deep dive into this.
Yeah.
I'm already hooked. Stay tuned, everyone, because this Gulf of America story is just getting started.
You know, as we're talking about this, It's worth remembering that the Gulf of Mexico isn't just a line on a map.
Right.
It's a living, breathing ecosystem,
That's true.
and a tremendously complex one at that.
We've been focusing on the political and economic angles, but we can't forget about the environmental side of this story.
Yeah.
What makes the Gulf of Mexico so unique from an ecological standpoint?
Well, it's incredibly biodiverse. I mean, we're talking about a vast expanse of water that supports countless species of fish, birds, marine mammals, you name it. It's a critical habitat for endangered sea turtles, a breeding ground for commercially valuable shrimp, and a haven for migratory birds.
It's like a giant underwater city teeming with life. And I bet a lot of people don't realize that this biodiversity directly impacts us,
Yeah,
even if we don't live right on the coast.
absolutely. The Gulf of Mexico is a vital part of the food chain supporting fisheries that provide seafood for millions of people. It also plays a crucial role in regulating climate patterns and protecting coastal communities from storms.
So any changes to the Gulf,
Yeah.
whether it's a name change or environmental degradation, could have ripple effects that extend far beyond Florida's borders.
Precisely. And that brings us back to the potential consequences of this renaming effort.
Yeah.
Could shifting the focus to Gulf of America subtly alter our perception of the Gulf's ecological importance?
Yeah.
Could it lead to a more U.S.-centric view of a shared resource?
It's almost like drawing a line in the water and saying this side is ours,
Yeah,
even though ecosystems don't respect political boundaries.
exactly. And that kind of thinking can have real-world implications for conservation efforts.
Right.
If we start seeing the Gulf as primarily an American asset,
Yeah.
it could make it harder to foster the international cooperation needed to address transboundary environmental challenges.
Challenges like climate change, which, as we mentioned earlier, is already impacting the Gulf in significant ways.
Right. We're talking about rising sea levels, ocean acidification, and more intense hurricanes,
Yeah.
all of which threaten the delicate balance of the Gulf's ecosystem.
And those threats don't discriminate based on national borders. So it seems like focusing on a name change could distract from the very real and urgent need to address these shared environmental problems.
That's a key point. While Florida lawmakers are pushing for this symbolic gesture, the clock's ticking on addressing these very real threats to the Gulf of Mexico's future.
That's a lot to consider.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, is changing a name really going to make a difference in the long run? Or are there more effective ways to promote national identity and protect this vital resource?
Those are the questions we're grappling with, and they're questions that each listener will have to answer for themselves. But one thing is for sure, understanding the complexity of this issue requires looking beyond the surface. It's about digging deeper into the historical context, the ecological realities, and the potential consequences of our actions, both intended and unintended.
Well said. And speaking of digging deeper, let's not forget that the Gulf of Mexico has a rich and fascinating history, one that's deeply intertwined with the stories of the people and cultures who have lived along its shores for centuries.
That's a great point. The Gulf has been a crossroads of trade, exploration, and conflict for as long as humans have inhabited this region. Its name itself, Gulf of Mexico, reflects that history, acknowledging the indigenous civilizations that thrived here long before European arrival.
So changing the name to Gulf of America could be seen as erasing or downplaying that history, couldn't it?
It's a valid concern. Names hold power, and they can shape our understanding of the past just as much as they can shape our vision of the future.
Right.
By renaming the Gulf, are we subtly shifting the narrative of this region, potentially at the expense of acknowledging its diverse cultural heritage?
It's a thought-provoking question,
Mm.
and it reminds me of the importance of understanding history, especially when it comes to make decisions that could have lasting impacts on our culture and identity.
Exactly.
Uh,
And it underscores the need for thoughtful and inclusive dialogue when it comes to making changes that affect shared spaces and resources.
Well, speaking of thoughtful dialogue, before we move on, let's take a moment to remind our listeners about the great work being done by meteorologist Rob Jones.
Absolutely. Rob's passion for weather and climate is truly inspiring.
If you're looking for more insights on these topics, be sure to follow Rob on Instagram at meteorologist, on TikTok as TV Meteorologist, and on YouTube, where you can also find the Meteorology Matters podcast playlist. His channel name is Rob Jones Hurricane.
A wealth of knowledge at your fingertips.
Now, returning to our discussion, we've explored the potential environmental and historical implications of renaming the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
But what about the practical side of things? What would it actually take to implement such a change?
That's a question worth considering. As we mentioned earlier, we're not just talking about updating a few maps and signs.
Right.
This would involve a massive overhaul of official documents, textbooks, legal codes, you name it.
And that would come with a hefty price tag, wouldn't
Yeah,
it?
absolutely. Think about all the state agencies, schools, businesses, and individuals that would have to update their materials. It would be a logistical nightmare and a significant drain on resources.
So has anyone in the Florida government actually crunched the numbers on this? Have they provided any estimates of the costs involved?
That's the thing. There hasn't been a lot of transparency about the potential financial burden of this renaming effort,
Hmm.
and that raises some red flags. Are taxpayers fully aware of the costs they could be shouldering?
It seems like a pretty big oversight, especially when you consider the other pressing issues facing Florida, like education funding and infrastructure improvements.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder about the priorities here.
Yeah.
Is renaming the Gulf of Mexico really the best use of taxpayer dollars,
Right.
especially in a state that's facing so many other challenges?
It's a valid question,
Yeah.
and it highlights the need for accountability and transparency in government spending.
Absolutely. Before embarking on such a massive undertaking, it's crucial to have a clear understanding of the costs involved and to ensure that those costs are justified in light of other pressing needs.
Well, speaking of cost, we've talked a lot about the potential economic impact of this name change, but we haven't really delved into the specifics. What industries could be most affected and how?
That's a great question. And to answer it, we need to look at the economic engines that rely on the Gulf of Mexico.
Like tourism.
Right. Hey,
Florida's beaches are a huge draw for visitors from all over the world.
exactly. The Gulf Coast is synonymous with sun, sand, and surf. Millions of tourists flock to Florida every year to enjoy its beautiful beaches, world-class fishing, and vibrant coastal culture.
So how could a name change impact that industry?
It could create branding and marketing challenges. Think about all the brochures, websites, and advertisements that feature the name Gulf of Mexico. Changing that name could require a massive rebranding effort,
Wow.
which could be costly and time-consuming for businesses.
And it could potentially confuse tourists who are already familiar with the name Gulf of Mexico.
That's right. Tourists from other states and countries might not immediately recognize Gulf of America and could be less likely to visit if they're not sure what to expect.
So there's a risk that a name change could actually hurt the tourism industry, at least in the short term.
It's definitely a possibility, and that's something Florida lawmakers need to consider carefully. After all, tourism is a major source of revenue for the state, supporting countless jobs and businesses.
And it's not just tourism that could be impacted. We mentioned fishing earlier. How could a name change affect that industry?
Well, the Gulf of Mexico is home to a thriving fishing industry, providing seafood for restaurants and markets across the country. Changing the name could create confusion in the marketplace and potentially impact sales.
It's like if suddenly your favorite brand of coffee changed its name. You might hesitate to buy it because you're not sure if it's the same product you know and love.
Exactly. Building brand recognition takes time and effort. A name change could disrupt that and create uncertainty for consumers.
And it's not just domestic markets that could be affected. The Gulf of Mexico is a major exporter of seafood, and a name change could create complications for international trade.
That's a good point. Trade agreements and regulations often specify the origin of products, including seafood. Changing the name of the Gulf could necessitate renegotiating those agreements, which could be a complex and time-consuming process.
So it seems like the economic implications of this name change are far-reaching and potentially unpredictable.
They are indeed. And it highlights the interconnectedness of our world, how even a seemingly simple change can have ripple effects across multiple sectors and even international borders.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah,
And it makes you wonder if the potential costs outweigh the perceived benefits.
that's a question worth pondering. And it's a question that we'll continue to explore as we delve deeper into the Gulf of America saga. It's interesting, isn't it? We've spent all this time talking about the potential downsides of this name change,
Right.
the costs, the confusion, the ecological and cultural implications.
Yeah.
But we haven't really explored the other side of the coin.
Right.
Are there any potential benefits to renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America?
That's a great point.
Yeah.
We've definitely been focusing on the challenges. But it's important to consider all angles. What are some of the arguments in favor of this name change?
Well, some proponents argue that it could foster a stronger sense of national identity and pride among Americans. The Gulf of Mexico, after all, plays a significant role in U.S. history, economy, and culture.
I can see that. It's like putting your stamp on something,
Yeah.
saying, this is ours. It's a way of asserting ownership and significance.
Exactly. And some might argue that it's a way to reclaim the narrative surrounding the Gulf.
Right.
to emphasize its importance to the United States and its role in shaping American identity.
But couldn't that also be seen as a form of nationalism? And wouldn't it potentially alienate other countries that border the Gulf, like Mexico and Cuba?
That's the tricky part. It's a fine line between promoting national pride and veering into exclusionary rhetoric.
Yeah.
It all depends on how the message is framed and received.
It's a gamble for sure. A name change could backfire and create more division than unity, especially in a region that's already grappling with complex geopolitical dynamics.
Absolutely. And it raises questions about, like, who benefits from such a change?
Yeah.
And who might be marginalized or overlooked?
It's a reminder that even something as seemingly simple as a name can be fraught with political and social implications.
It certainly can. And it highlights the need for careful consideration and inclusive dialogue when making decisions that could impact multiple communities and cultures.
Well, speaking of dialogue, let's shift gears for a moment and remind our listeners about the great resources available from meteorologist Rob Jones.
Always a good idea. Rob is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to weather and climate.
If you're interested in learning more about these topics, be sure to follow Rob on Instagram at meteorologist, on TikTok as TV Meteorologist, and on YouTube, where you can also find the Meteorology Matters podcast playlist. His channel name is Rob Jones Hurricane.
Great reminder.
Now, getting back to our discussion. We've talked a lot about the potential pros and cons of renaming the Gulf of Mexico, but ultimately it seems like this decision comes down to values.
I agree. What do we value more, national identity or inclusivity? Symbolic gestures or practical solutions? Historical continuity or the right to redefine our relationship with the world around us?
Those are some big questions.
Yeah.
And they're questions that each listener will have to grapple with on their own.
Yeah.
There's no easy answer, no one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. But that's what makes this conversation so important. It forces us to confront our own biases and assumptions,
Right.
to consider different perspectives,
Yeah.
and to engage in thoughtful debate.
And it reminds us that even seemingly small decisions can have ripple effects that extend far beyond our immediate sphere of influence.
Absolutely. So as you continue to ponder this Gulf of America conundrum, I encourage you to think critically, to ask questions, and to engage in constructive conversations with those who hold different views.
It's about finding common ground, even amidst disagreement, and working together to create a future that reflects our shared values and aspirations.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this episode of Meteorology Matters. It's been a thought-provoking journey exploring the complexities of a seemingly simple name change.
It certainly has, and I hope our listeners have found it as insightful and engaging as we have. Remember, even in a world that's constantly changing, knowledge is power.
And the ability to think critically and engage in meaningful dialogue is essential for navigating the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
So until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and remember,
Even a name can make waves.